March 17, 1943. A cold, gray morning settled over occupied Europe. From Lisbon to Stockholm, from Berlin to Rome, the machinery of war ground relentlessly forward. Yet behind the smoke of battles and the thunder of artillery, another war was being fought, a silent, invisible war. A war of whispers, radio signals, and coded messages. On this day, German intelligence officers and their networks of spies began to confront a chilling reality. Reports were pouring in from occupied France, from neutral countries, and from the Atlantic. Reports that painted a picture far darker than Hitler or the German High Command wished to see. This was the day when many within the German intelligence community knew, perhaps for the first time with certainty, that the war they had unleashed in 1939 could not be won. The intelligence battlefield. World War II was not only fought with tanks, planes, and ships, it was fought with information. And the German war machine had invested heavily in espionage. Their intelligence services, the Abwehr under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, and the Sicherheit, the SS intelligence branch, ran networks across Europe. They placed agents in Britain, in the United States, in North Africa, and even inside the Soviet Union. Their mission? Measure Allied strength, predict enemy movements, and uncover weaknesses. But by 1943, those very networks were unraveling. Unknown to Berlin, many German spies in Britain had been turned by MI5 and were now feeding false information back to Germany in what became known as the double-cross system. The deception was so effective that by the spring of 1943, the Germans were basing critical military decisions on lies carefully crafted by the Allies. Still, the Abwehr continued to receive fragments of the truth from elsewhere, from embassies, from intercepted conversations, from informants who risked their lives to observe Allied production. And by March 1943, these fragments formed a mosaic of despair. The turning point of the Atlantic War. At the heart of Germany's strategy was the Battle of the Atlantic. If U-boats could strangle Britain by cutting off supplies, the Reich might still force a negotiated peace. For years, Admiral Donitz's wolf packs had ravaged Allied shipping, sending millions of tons of supplies to the ocean floor. But in early 1943, the tide began to turn. Convoys that had once been easy prey were now escorted by long-range aircraft equipped with radar, depth charges, and the new Hedgehog anti-submarine weapon. The Allies had cracked the Enigma codes, allowing them to anticipate U-boat movements. On March 17, 1943, a convoy battle reached its climax in the mid-Atlantic. Convoy HX-229 and SC-122, sailing from New York to Britain, came under massive U-boat assault. Over the next days, dozens of merchant ships were sunk, but the Germans paid a heavy price. Their losses were mounting, their tactics exposed. Intelligence officers monitoring U-boat reports realized with horror that Britain's lifeline could no longer be severed. For German spies observing from afar, the conclusion was unavoidable. The Atlantic War, once their best hope, was slipping away. Reports from America, the arsenal of democracy. Perhaps the most shocking intelligence reached Berlin from across the Atlantic. In neutral capitals like Lisbon and Madrid, German agents carefully tracked shipping manifests, trade records, and eyewitness accounts of industrial output. By March 1943, the numbers defied belief. American factories were producing more aircraft, tanks, and trucks than Germany could ever hope to match. Henry Ford's Willow Run plant was assembling a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels, slid off American shipyards at a rate that stunned even the Allies. On March 17th, reports compiled by German attachés in Spain highlighted U.S. production statistics that filtered through newspapers and commercial bulletins. Even if exaggerated, they painted a terrifying picture. One German Abwehr officer dryly noted, "If the figures are even half correct, the war is already lost." The German spies could do the math. No matter how brave their soldiers, no matter how skilled their generals, the industrial power of the United States was overwhelming. Cracks within the Reich. Meanwhile, back in Berlin, Admiral Canaris of the Abwehr was already a skeptic of Hitler's war. His private reports to colleagues in March 1943 were increasingly pessimistic. He had seen the Soviet front grind on miraculously, consuming divisions faster than they could be replaced. He had heard whispers from informants that German allies in Italy and Romania were wavering. And he knew from his own spies abroad that Germany's enemies were outproducing them on every front. March 17th was not just another day. It was the moment when the mounting weight of intelligence from the Atlantic, from America, from occupied Europe became undeniable. The Reich was on a course collision with defeat, even if its leaders refused to admit it. Shadows in neutral cities. In Lisbon, the city of spies, German agents met that day in cafes and hotel lobbies, with informants and couriers. Information passed in whispers over cups of coffee, encoded telegrams sent through diplomatic channels. In Stockholm, where Swedish neutrality provided a cover for espionage, German military attachés heard troubling news from businessmen who traveled freely between Britain and Scandinavia. Shipments of Allied aircraft and fuel were increasing, not decreasing. Britain was not starving. On the contrary, it was preparing for something bigger. In Madrid, the German embassy compiled notes on American diplomats' casual boasts about production levels. These fragments of truth slipped through the cracks of censorship and propaganda, reaching German ears in time to erode what remained of confidence. By the evening of March 17, 1943, German intelligence files told a story that Hitler himself would not accept. His generals might cling to hope on the Eastern Front. His propaganda might boast of U-boat victories. But the men who lived in the shadows, the spies, the intelligence officers, the codebreakers, knew otherwise. They had seen the Allied convoy systems harden, the American factories roar to life, and the Soviet front absorb the worst Germany could throw at it. This was the day when the facade cracked, the day when German spies whispered among themselves, "The war is lost. It is only a matter of time." Serious and dramatic documentary. Eastern Front Realities. While German spies gathered grim reports from the Atlantic and the United States, the Eastern Front told an even harsher truth. The Wehrmacht's catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 had already shocked the world. More than 90,000 German soldiers had marched into Soviet captivity, and entire armies had been annihilated. For intelligence officers, March 17, 1943 was haunted by what came next. Reports from agents in Eastern Europe and occupied Soviet territories painted a stark picture. The Red Army was no longer broken. It was reorganizing, replenishing, and growing in strength. Soviet industry, relocated east of the Ural Mountains, was producing tanks and aircraft in staggering numbers. German informants in neutral Turkey whispered of Soviet supply trains moving day and night, and of new divisions forming near Kursk. The message was clear: the Eastern Front could not be stabilized indefinitely. Even if the Wehrmacht struck again in the summer, German spies knew the tide was shifting irreversibly. Crumbling faith in allies. Another thread of intelligence that weighed heavily on German minds by March 1943 was the loyalty of their allies. Italy, Romania, and Hungary were bleeding on the Eastern Front, their divisions shattered alongside German units.
In Rome, Italian officials privately admitted to neutral diplomats that Mussolini's regime was under pressure at home. In Bucharest, Romanian leaders grumbled that they were sacrificing soldiers for a war that no longer promised victory. German intelligence officers stationed in neutral capitals gathered these whispers and relayed them back to Berlin. If Italy or Romania broke away from the Axis, the Reich would be left dangerously exposed in the Balkans and Mediterranean. On March 17, 1943, Canaris and others in the Abwehr began sketching scenarios in which Germany might one day stand alone, and none of those scenarios ended in triumph. The MI5 deception becomes apparent. What the Germans did not fully realize on March 17th, but what their spies sometimes suspected, was how compromised their intelligence networks had become. In Britain, every single German agent had been caught, turned, or neutralized. The MI5 double-cross system was feeding Berlin a carefully constructed illusion that Britain was weaker than it was, that invasion plans were delayed, that Allied intentions were scattered. But cracks appeared. A handful of German officers, cross-checking reports from different sources, noticed inconsistencies. The information from Britain often did not align with reports from neutral Europe. A senior Abwehr officer privately remarked, "We are chasing shadows. Someone is controlling what we see." On March 17, 1943, that creeping doubt joined the growing body of evidence that their intelligence war was collapsing from within. The Allies' growing air supremacy. If the Atlantic War was slipping away and the Eastern Front looked grim, German spies also observed the skies. From January through March 1943, Allied bombing raids against the Ruhr and other industrial centers intensified. Informants in occupied France reported the constant roar of American and British bombers overhead and the steady buildup of airfields across Britain. By mid-March, German attachés in Stockholm and Madrid had pieced together a sobering reality. The Allies were preparing an air offensive on a scale never before seen. Aircraft production figures from America, already overwhelming, now translated into visible squadrons of B-17s, B-24s, and Spitfires massing for sustained campaigns. The German Luftwaffe, stretched thin across multiple fronts, could not match this buildup. On March 17, 1943, German intelligence officers quietly recorded that air superiority, once Germany's advantage, was slipping permanently into Allied hands. Morale reports from occupied Europe. Another layer of intelligence came from within occupied Europe itself. Networks of informants, collaborators, and sympathizers sent daily updates to German field offices. By March 1943, these reports carried troubling undertones. In France, resistance movements were growing bolder, sabotaging rail lines and ambushing German patrols. In the Netherlands, discontent simmered beneath the surface. In Norway, whispers of Allied landings circulated, fueled by clandestine radio broadcasts. The Germans tried to dismiss these as isolated incidents, yet intelligence analysts recognized a broader pattern. The occupied nations were no longer subdued. On March 17th, one Abwehr report noted, "The occupied peoples appear to expect Allied victory. Their behavior reflects this confidence." For a spy service tasked with measuring the mood of Europe, the conclusion was devastating. Even the subjugated were betting on Germany's defeat. Canaris and the whisper of treason. By early 1943, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, had become increasingly disillusioned with Hitler. His skepticism was not yet open treason, but it colored the way he interpreted reports. On March 17, 1943, he read summaries from Madrid, Stockholm, and Lisbon, each filled with dire statistics and pessimistic forecasts. To some of his colleagues, he remarked, "Our enemies have the resources of the world. We only have time, and time is against us." These words, preserved later in post-war accounts, encapsulated the growing despair within German intelligence circles. While Hitler still believed in decisive victories ahead, his own spies were already mourning a war they believed could not be won. A silent realization. The importance of March 17, 1943, lay not in a single battle or a dramatic political announcement, but in the convergence of intelligence. The Atlantic, the Eastern Front, the Allies' production, the disloyalty of partners, the growth of resistance, and the collapse of German spy networks. On that day, in offices lit by dim lamps in Berlin, Madrid, and Lisbon, German officers compared notes and silently reached the same conclusion. Germany's war was unwinnable. It would take more than 2 years of bloodshed, destruction, and suffering before that truth became undeniable to Hitler himself. But for the men who lived in the shadows, who saw the war through intercepted telegrams and whispered conversations, March 17th was the day they knew. End of Part 2. Approximately 1,000 words.
Strategic consequences of March 17. For most Germans, March 17, 1943 passed like any other day of the war, with ration lines, air raid sirens, and propaganda broadcasts promising victory. But inside the quiet rooms of the Abwehr and the Sicherheitsdienst, the information collected that day reshaped their outlook. The first consequence was strategic doubt. Intelligence officers began to recognize that no matter how many tactical victories the Wehrmacht could achieve, the resources of the Allies would outweigh them. It was a terrifying acknowledgement. Germany was trapped in a war of attrition it could never win. This recognition did not immediately alter Hitler's decisions, but it influenced the way German officers approached their work. Some became fatalistic, convinced their duty was simply to slow the inevitable. Others, like Canaris, began exploring discreet channels of communication with anti-Nazi figures, hoping to prepare for a post-Hitler Germany. The strain on the U-boat arm. One of the clearest signals German spies analyzed after March 17 was the decline of the U-boat's effectiveness. During the HX-229 SC-122 battle, U-boats sank more than 20 merchant vessels, a tactical success. But they also lost several submarines, and more importantly, their reports revealed the growing strength of Allied countermeasures. The Allies were deploying escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, and radar at a scale Germany could not match. German intelligence staffers realized that the balance of the Atlantic campaign had shifted. The Allies were closing the mid-Atlantic gap, the only region where U-boats had once operated freely. Soon there would be no safe hunting grounds left. For the Abwehr analysts, this meant the last real chance to starve Britain into submission was fading. Once Britain's survival was assured, it could serve as the springboard for Allied invasion plans, a prospect they dreaded. Signals from the Soviet Union. Alongside the Atlantic developments, March 17th brought grim confirmation from the Soviet front. Reports filtered in from neutral Sweden and Switzerland, where businessmen and diplomats who traveled east carried word of Soviet resilience. German spies noted that Soviet industry, relocated to the Urals, was producing aircraft and tanks in overwhelming numbers. The feared T-34 tank was not only being built faster than German panzers, but also being improved. Soviet divisions were replenishing far more quickly than expected, despite catastrophic losses. The Abwehr officers cross-checked these reports against the grim tally from Stalingrad. The Sixth Army destroyed, thousands of troops captured, German prestige shattered. On March 17th, the picture became undeniable. The Soviets were not collapsing, they were preparing for a counterstroke. The shadow of an Allied invasion. Another dimension of March 17's intelligence flow was speculation about Allied intentions in Western Europe. In neutral cities, rumors abounded. Some claimed the Allies were preparing to land in Norway. Others insisted North Africa was merely the first step and Sicily or Italy would follow. German intelligence officers sorting through these conflicting reports struggled to find clarity. Yet one thing was obvious: the Allies were building towards a major offensive.
In Lisbon, an Abwehr agent overheard American officers boasting in a hotel lounge that the war will be carried back to the continent sooner than Hitler thinks. In Stockholm, shipping manifests hinted at massive supply movements to Britain. These fragments suggested that Germany's enemies were no longer on the defensive, they were preparing to strike. For German intelligence, March 17th marked the first time they realized an invasion of Europe was not a distant dream, it was a looming reality. The collapse of faith in propaganda. Inside Germany, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels painted a picture of unshakable victory. Posters proclaimed "final victory," and radio broadcast assured listeners that setbacks were temporary. But for those who worked in intelligence, reality clashed violently with propaganda. Reports from the front contradicted official statements. Intercepted Allied broadcasts mocked German claims with statistics that German officers knew were correct. By March 17th, the gap between propaganda and intelligence had become too wide to ignore. In private conversations, some German spies admitted to one another that they no longer believed the Reich's public narrative. This internal collapse of faith would not be seen on the streets of Berlin, but in the shadowy world of espionage, it was profound. Seeds of resistance within the Reich. The most significant impact of March 17, 1943 was psychological. Once key intelligence officers concluded the war was unwinnable, the question became, what now? For Canaris and some of his associates, this realization pushed them further towards quiet resistance. They began making discreet contacts with figures in the German opposition and with neutral governments, hinting that not all within Germany supported Hitler's course. These were dangerous steps. Open opposition meant death. But intelligence officers, more than most, understood the trajectory of the war, and on March 17th, their conviction hardened. If Germany could not win, perhaps it needed saving from within. The war's invisible turning point. Historians often debate when World War II turned against Germany, Stalingrad, El Alamein, Midway. But within the shadowy corridors of German intelligence, March 17, 1943 was its own turning point. It was the day that data, whispers, and coded messages converged to tell a single story. The Reich was doomed. The frontline troops might still fight with courage, and Hitler might still boast of final victory, but the spies knew better. In their eyes, the war had already been lost. Only the ending remained unwritten.
Hitler's denial. While German spies quietly accepted that the war was slipping away, Adolf Hitler saw only the path of defiance. On March 17, 1943, he convened his staff at the Wolf's Lair and ranted about new offensives, new weapons, and total victory. To him, setbacks were temporary, victories were always just one campaign away. Hitler still believed in decisive operations. He was already turning his attention to the summer offensive at Kursk, hoping to deliver a knockout blow against the Red Army. He dismissed warnings about Allied production and insisted that German skill and courage would outmatch sheer numbers. But the intelligence services, the very men tasked with gathering the facts, knew otherwise. Their reports contradicted his vision. They saw the growing disparity in resources, the shifting balance at sea and in the air, and the crumbling reliability of Germany's allies. On March 17th, Hitler's refusal to face reality created a gulf between him and his own spies, a gulf that would only widen as the war dragged on. The desperation for a wonder weapon. By 1943, Hitler's faith in technology became almost religious. He placed his hopes in Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, that would supposedly reverse Germany's fortunes. Rockets, jet aircraft, and new submarines were in development, and Hitler often spoke of them as decisive tools. German intelligence officers, however, knew the timeline. Reports from within Germany's own production sectors revealed delays, shortages of raw materials, and sabotage within factories. The V-2 rocket, still in testing, consumed vast resources but could not change the strategic imbalance. On March 17th, analysts compared Allied production curves with Germany's experimental projects. The conclusion was stark.
No single weapon, however advanced, could outweigh the avalanche of tanks, bombers, and ships pouring from American and Soviet factories. To the spies, Hitler's obsession with wonder weapons seemed like desperation, a gambler clinging to fantasies as the odds grew worse. The reality of German industry. German intelligence also monitored its own industrial capacity. Reports from the Reich's Ministry of Armaments revealed bottlenecks, Allied bombing disruptions, and shortages in skilled labor. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, had succeeded in streamlining production after 1942, but even his improvements could not match the sheer scale of Allied industry. By March 1943, Germany was producing more weapons than before, yet it still fell hopelessly behind. Abwehr officers tasked with analyzing economic trends noted that American shipyards alone outproduced the entire German Navy every year. U.S. aircraft plants built more bombers in a month than Germany could in several. On March 17th, these reports underscored the futility of continuing the war on industrial terms. Numbers were not just against Germany, they were crushing. Cracks in occupied Europe deepened. While Hitler continued to claim control over Europe, German spies saw the opposite. Reports from occupied France, the Netherlands, and Belgium described a growing resistance network. Radio intercepts revealed clandestine communication between underground groups and London. By mid-March 1943, resistance attacks on rail lines and supply depots had increased noticeably. In France, partisans sabotaged German trains carrying war materials. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans had carved out entire regions beyond German control. On March 17th, Abwehr analysts noted that the resistance no longer seemed like scattered uprisings. It was evolving into a coordinated movement, guided and supplied by the Allies. This meant Germany was fighting not just external enemies, but also internal ones, draining manpower and resources. The illusion of control. Propaganda in Berlin spoke of unity, discipline, and iron will, but intelligence painted a far darker picture. German spies reported that in Italy, morale was collapsing under the weight of defeats in North Africa. In Hungary and Romania, governments hesitated to commit more troops to the Eastern Front. Even within Germany, reports filtered in of war weariness among civilians. On March 17th, the Abwehr compiled notes indicating that Germany's coalition was fragile. Hitler demanded loyalty, but his allies were edging towards self-preservation. The illusion of control, so carefully crafted in speeches and newspapers, was dissolving under the scrutiny of espionage. Canaris versus Himmler. The intelligence world within Germany was also divided. The Abwehr under Admiral Canaris grew increasingly skeptical of Hitler's war, while the SS Sicherdienst under Reinhard Heydrich's successors and ultimately Heinrich Himmler demanded loyalty to the Führer above all. On March 17th, reports from the two agencies clashed. The Abwehr quietly circulated analyses pointing towards inevitable defeat, while the SS focused on rooting out defeatist thinking and maintaining Hitler's faith in victory. This rivalry meant that intelligence was politicized, truth became dangerous, and facts could be dismissed as treason. For the spies who knew the war was lost, survival now meant speaking carefully or not at all. The burden of knowledge. For those within German intelligence, March 17, 1943, was not just another day of paperwork and coded telegrams. It was the day when many fully internalized what the evidence had been hinting at for months. The war was unwinnable. Yet they were trapped between the facts they uncovered and the fantasies their leaders clung to. They could not tell the German people. They could not openly oppose Hitler. Their knowledge was a private burden, shared only in whispers among trusted colleagues. And so, even as soldiers died at the front and civilians endured bombings, the spies of the Reich carried a terrible secret. The war had already been lost in everything but name. The Allied intelligence edge. If German spies felt despair on March 17, 1943, it was because their adversaries had mastered the Shadow War. The Allies were not just fighting on the battlefield, they were winning in the realm of intelligence. The most decisive factor was Ultra, the Allied code-breaking project. From the secret rooms of Bletchley Park, British cryptanalysts were cracking German Enigma codes daily. This meant Allied convoys could evade U-boat wolf packs, and Allied bombers could avoid Luftwaffe traps. Every time German commanders thought they had the element of surprise, the Allies already knew. German spies had no idea how deeply compromised their communications were, yet they sensed something uncanny was happening. U-boats seemed to stumble into ambushes with unnatural regularity. Luftwaffe raids were intercepted with unnerving precision. On March 17th, Abwehr analysts wrote of inexplicable coincidences that undermined German operations. What they could not admit was that their enemy could read their secrets almost as soon as they were sent. MI5's double-cross web. If Ultra was invisible, the British double-cross system was theatrical. MI5 had captured every German spy who landed in Britain and forced them to work as double agents. Through these channels, Berlin received a steady stream of lies. They were told of phantom military units, false invasion plans, and fabricated weaknesses in Allied defenses. By 1943, German war planning relied heavily on this poisoned intelligence. On March 17th, while Berlin was digesting bleak reports from neutral cities, they were simultaneously being reassured by their British agents that Britain remained vulnerable. The contradiction gnawed at some German analysts. If Britain was weak, why did reports from Lisbon and Madrid suggest American supplies were flooding in? A few suspected manipulation, but the deception was too well constructed to unravel. The Allies had turned German espionage into a weapon against itself. Soviet espionage strikes back. On the Eastern Front, the intelligence war played out differently. Soviet espionage was aggressive, deeply embedded, and devastating. The Red Orchestra, a network of Soviet spies, operated across Europe, feeding Moscow valuable details and German troop movements. By March 1943, Soviet intelligence had already penetrated parts of the German command structure. When the Germans prepared for their summer offensive at Kursk, Soviet spies passed the plans to Moscow long before the first tank moved. German counterintelligence knew leaks were happening but could not stop them. On March 17th, Abwehr reports acknowledged dangerous breaches of security in occupied territories. They could not say it aloud, but the truth was evident. The Soviets knew too much, too soon. The fraying of German networks abroad. As the Allies tightened their grip, German spy networks abroad began to collapse. In the United States, the FBI dismantled most of Germany's espionage cells by 1941–42. By 1943, Abwehr reports from America were scarce, outdated, or unreliable. In Latin America, where German agents had once thrived, Allied counterintelligence and diplomatic pressure forced networks into hiding. By March 17th, the once global reach of German intelligence had shrunk. Reliable sources were few, and even those were often contradicted by battlefield outcomes. The Reich's spies were going blind. Psychological warfare. The Allies also waged psychological war. Radio broadcasts from London and Washington targeted occupied Europe and even German soldiers themselves. These programs revealed details of battles and losses that German propaganda concealed, undermining faith in the Reich's narrative. For spies monitoring foreign broadcasts, the effect was unsettling. Allied radio often reported details that should have been secret: convoy arrivals, U-boat sinkings, Luftwaffe casualties. On March 17th, Abwehr officers listening to BBC broadcasts realized that Allied knowledge of the war exceeded what seemed possible. It was another reminder that their enemies had mastered intelligence on a level Germany could not match. Neutral capitals, silent witnesses. Lisbon, Stockholm, Madrid, and Bern were the great crossroads of espionage. On March 17, 1943, they buzzed with whispers and coded telegrams. Allied and Axis agents sat in the same cafes, watching one another, trading rumors. In Lisbon, Allied agents made sure German spies overheard inflated statistics about American production, statistics that were, if anything, understatements. In Stockholm, Soviet and British officers discreetly shared intelligence, knowing German ears were nearby. German spies collected all of this, but instead of reassurance, it produced despair. Every neutral capital confirmed the same thing. The Allies were growing stronger, Germany weaker. The invisible collapse of confidence. For German intelligence, March 17th marked more than the gathering of facts. It was the day confidence broke. The Abwehr had prided itself on professionalism. The Sicherheitsdienst had claimed ideological purity. But both found themselves staring at the same reality. They were losing not only the material war, but the intelligence war as well. Their adversaries outproduced, outmaneuvered, and outthought them at every turn. Even their successes, like sinking merchant ships or occupying vast territories, were temporary illusions. On March 17th, the realization spread like a shadow. They were trapped in a war of lies, and the Allies were better liars. The burden of silence. German spies could not share their despair openly. To admit the truth was dangerous. The SS considered pessimism treason, and defeatism could lead to execution. And so the knowledge stayed hidden, buried in classified reports, whispered in coded phrases between trusted colleagues. Outwardly, they saluted, filed their paperwork, and repeated the slogans of victory. Inwardly, they mourned. For them, March 17, 1943 was not just another day in the war. It was the day their own craft betrayed them, the day their skills showed them a future their leaders refused to see. End of Part 5. Approximately 1,000 words.